Hey everyone, Dr. Lee Bryce here, and today I am making a video for you since we will not have in-person class on Friday, April 4th. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and get started by sharing the PowerPoint for today. So today we're talking about marriage, family, and heteronormativity, and you'll see that's online today. So I'm going to do some housekeeping things. I'm going to lecture for a little bit and then I'll do reminders. Notice that your exit pass is missing this week. That's because I'll be traveling so much over the next couple of weeks. I don't think that I'll have time to read an exit pass while I'm in DC, so I didn't think it was fair to make you do it if I wouldn't be able to read your responses in a timely manner. So you don't have to do that this week, but we'll get back into the groove of things on Monday when we're back in person. After watching this video that I'm currently recording, make sure to complete in-class free write 3 for points. It's worth 10 points like it normally is. You'll see that you're completing in-class free write 3 in the discussion forum, and then you also need to respond to a classmate in order to receive the full 10 points. So you'll write your essay responding to the questions that I post for you like you normally do, 3 to 5 paragraphs, referencing the textbook at least once. You know the drill. But then you also need to respond to a classmate in order to receive full credit. Now, in addition to earning the normal 10 points you typically get for completing an in-class free write, you also will get 1 point toward your attendance credit for watching the video and completing in-class free write 3. So technically, that's worth 11 points. And then I also want to remind you that class is again going to be online Friday, April 11th, because I'm traveling to Charlotte, North Carolina for a conference related to sociology. I present on Thursday and Saturday, so there was no way to avoid missing class Friday. And this setup for that class session online will be similar to this one. Because I'll be attending a conference, I won't be able to meet with you in real time on Zoom. So instead, you'll do something on Blackboard. I'll likely create a video like I am right now, and you'll do everything electronically on your own time. If you have any questions or announcements you'd like to share with your classmates, feel free to email me and I will respond as best I can given my travel schedule. And I will also share any announcements you might have with your classmates via announcements and email on Blackboard. Okay, so jumping into our chapter on marriage, family, and heteronormativity. A family, this is a term we use all the time in our everyday social world, so you probably have a basic lay understanding of this term. But a textbook definition is a social group usually related by marriage, partnership, adoption, or kinship. And there are different types of family structures depending on the society and the culture in which you live. You might have a different sort of norm around what a family structure looks like. Things that often influence family structures include economic consideration and romantic love. So, if we think about in the United States, what family structures tended to look like before industrialization, typically families were larger because we had a more agrarian focused society where folks were working on farms. And it made sense to have bigger families and lots of children because you needed people in your family to work the farm. However, as more and more families moved into urban areas because of industrialization to work in factories, all of a sudden you have lots of people in these urban spaces with not a lot of places for them to live. And so now it makes sense to have smaller families because having a big family with lots of children, those are just additional mouths you have to feed. And so you want people, we have wage laborers in the factories now, you want smaller families. We can also think about how families members don't necessarily, or how we think about family doesn't necessarily have to be connected to kinship and who you're biologically related to. Adoption being one of those examples, but another example I like to give is the TV show The Golden Girls. So if you're unfamiliar, it's a TV show from the 80s, and these retired women live in a house that one of the women owns in Miami. They're all retired in Miami. And so in order to save money, economic considerations, they live together even though only two of the four women are biologically related. They're a mother and a daughter. And so there's an episode where one of the women who is not biologically related to any of the other women, she had surgery and she wakes up in the hospital and she's asking the nurse for her girls. And the nurse thinks that she's referring to her daughters. So the nurse says, "Oh, they're on their way. They're traveling from out of state." And she says, "No, no, my girls." And she's referring to the women that she lives with because those are the people she lives with. And that's who she considers to be her family. So family doesn't necessarily have to be people you're related to. It can be people who you live with. And we know that in a modern United States context, people typically live with their partner, the person they're married to, and their nuclear families. So, if you think of the stereotypical American dream, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, dog, white picket fence, that's what we stereotypically think of. But we know that there are all different types of family structures, and in other societies and other cultures, we see extended family living together in the same household with grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins. And when I lived in Hawaii, that was more common. We would even have ohana houses where there would be an upstairs and a downstairs, and grandparents might live upstairs and then the family with the kids would live downstairs. So we see different dynamics sort of following norms depending on our society and the culture in which we live. Now, when we think about how modern families operate, we can think about the second shift, Arlie Hochschild's work, this idea that many women perform a first shift of paid work and a second shift of domestic responsibilities when they get home. So with her work, she started noticing that in the 90s, more and more women were working full-time jobs and having careers outside of the home. Her hypothesis essentially was that because women were having careers where they were making good money, they weren't just working to make ends meet, that the household responsibilities in terms of chores around the house and taking care of children would be more equitably distributed amongst men and women, husbands and wives. However, as she started interviewing these women who were middle class, upper middle class, who were working these high-powered jobs, having really successful careers, what she found is that when they got home, they were still doing the bulk of child rearing and household chores. And even when men were helping out, because of course men do contribute to family and household chores, the work that they were doing was still coded in masculine ways, and the work women were doing was still coded in feminine ways. And that translated into men doing things that lacked a sense of urgency. They were chores around the house that could wait until the next day or the next week if needed, and they tended to take less time. So for example, men tend to be responsible for taking out the trash and doing lawn care. Certainly, your house is not going to smell good if you wait a day or two to take out the trash, but no one's immediate survival needs will be neglected if you wait a day or two to take out the trash. Similarly, doing yard work can wait a little while if there's something else that comes up in your professional world. However, things like preparing meals and going grocery shopping that are coded feminine, those are things that are really urgent. If they don't happen, then your kids don't eat. And so their basic needs aren't being met. If you don't do laundry, another household chore that's coded as feminine, and your kids show up to school in dirty clothes, you run the risk of having Child Protective Services called on your family. So these chores around the house that are coded in feminine ways are very urgent and need to be done on a regular basis. They also tend to take up more time. And so we continue to see this inequitable distribution of household chores because of how chores tend to be coded masculine and feminine even today. Heteronormativity is a belief that normalizes and naturalizes heterosexuality, which is sexual attraction between women and men. And so, even as we see more and more families and the normalization of same sex couples in the United States and in a lot of other countries across the world, we still see family units operating in heteronormative ways. And so, even if you have a family with two moms or two dads, there is this expectation that one partner will behave in stereotypical masculine ways and the other partner will behave in stereotypically feminine ways, taking on those more child rearing like responsibilities in the household. And then finally, we can't talk about marriage and family without talking about weddings or the wedding industrial complex, which is the escalation of wedding expenses over the past few decades. And if we connect this to earlier chapters in the textbook, specifically chapter 2, where we were learning about norms and values and things like that, we really place a strong value on having a a traditional wedding experience, especially in the United States, even though traditionally weddings have had this religious component to them. Even as we in the United States are less and less religious, we still have that value and that norm of having a traditional wedding experience, oftentimes with some sort of religious component to the ceremony where you're going to get married at a church or a synagogue or a mosque or something like that. Okay, now we've learned about Arlie Hochschild's work in the second shift. We can also think about maybe a little bit more of a radical approach to understanding family dynamics and the inequitable distribution of chores and things around the house. And so for that, we turn to Sylvia Federici's work, Wages Against Housework. Now, she was an up and coming philosopher and theorist during the 1970s and the feminist movement, the second wave of feminism. And so during this time, there were different camps as far as how radical women and their approaches were to sort of dismantling stereotypes around how men and women should behave. And I would argue that Sylvia Federici is on the more radical end of that spectrum. We refer to this type of work as feminist Marxists because they took Marx and his work on conflict theory, where he was looking at social class and the experiences and exploitation of workers in the factories during industrialization. They took that work in the 1960s and 1970s and applied it to the labor exploitation women experience and family dynamics. And so in order to learn more about Sylvia Federici's work and Wages Against Housework, here's a really interesting YouTube video. It's pretty short. I do expect you to watch that in preparation for In-Class Free Write 3, but she is talking about what was happening in the 1960s and 70s related to feminist Marxism and the women's rights movement, and specifically how it relates to how women are exploited, in large part due to traditional family structures and norms and expectations related to how men and women are expected to behave. Okay. And then finally, throughout our textbook, at the end of almost every chapter, the authors talk about different methodology. And I haven't done the greatest job this semester of reviewing methodology. However, it is covered in your textbook. So I wanted to take a minute to do that today. So, one of the most important things I hope students can walk away from remembering at the end of our class, like if you don't remember anything else from SOC 100 regarding methodology, but this, I would be really happy. So knowing the difference between quantitative versus qualitative research, that's sort of the highest level way in which you can organize different methodological ways of collecting data in the social sciences. And so what's the difference? Quantitative data is looking at numbers using survey data to do a statistical analysis, often with a software package like SPSS or Stata. So sometimes you write and create and collect your own survey. Sometimes you use secondary data from government agencies like the FBI, for example. They have a crime victimization data set, things like that. Qualitative data is using words. And so stereotypically we think about like interviews or focus groups and things like that, but we can also analyze other words. We can do a content analysis of newspaper articles, for example. And so that's the biggest difference between quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is you're looking at numbers and doing statistical analysis of survey data. Qualitative, you're analyzing words, looking at interview data and other written texts. So how do we know what method to use? Well, it depends on what your research questions are and what your end goal is with your research project. So sometimes it makes more sense, especially if you want to be able to generalize a particular thing that you're measuring and researching to the overall population, everyone within a particular society or group of people, then probably you want to do a quantitative project where you're analyzing survey data from a sample, a subset of that group that you wish to know more about. But if you want to have more in depth interactions with someone who is an expert on a particular topic, perhaps interviewing folks who have that expertise and then analyzing their interview data makes more sense. So it just depends on what your goal is, what your topic is, what your research questions are, and things like that. And so I gave you some examples already of data sets, but you can collect data yourself by writing survey questions and sending that out to the people you wish to study. Or you can rely on data already collected. Government entities are great sources of secondary data if you want to do a quantitative project. And then you can also collect your own qualitative data by doing interviews and things like that. Or you can also rely on secondary data for qualitative projects by looking at newspaper articles or court documents, things that are already publicly available to you, and then analyzing the words from those documents. So like I said at the beginning of this video, we will not have an exit pass this week. I'm sorry, this class period, because I don't think with my travel schedule to DC, I'll have the ability to read your responses in a timely manner. However, on Monday, when we meet back in person, we'll go back to our regular setup and there will be an exit pass. Feel free to email me if you have any questions in the meantime. Don't forget to bring your name tag on Monday. Start reading chapter 9, complete in-class free write 3, and don't forget to respond to a classmate. That's something that's a little bit different for this in-class free write compared to the first two. And have a nice weekend. I will see you on Monday when I'm back in town.